The restaurant was bustling as usual, filled with the clinking of plates and the hum of lively conversation. A woman walked in quietly, her demeanor calm but confident. She dressed simply, her warm smile unassuming, as she took a seat at one of the tables near the window. The waitress greeted her cheerfully, but the waiter assigned to the table gave her a sideways glance, muttering something under his breath before strolling over with an air of disinterest. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone sharp, his eyes scanning her as if she didn't belong there. The woman remained polite, ignoring his dismissive attitude. She ordered a coffee and asked for a recommendation, but his answers were curt, almost rude. His body language made it clear he didn't think she was worth his time. A few customers nearby noticed the interaction, exchanging uncomfortable glances, but no one intervened. Things escalated when the woman asked for the manager to discuss a special dish she had seen on the menu before. The waiter smirked, leaning on the table. "We don't take custom orders from just anyone," he said loudly, his words dripping with condescension. The woman's face fell slightly, but she kept her composure, asking politely again. This seemed to irritate him even more. Unbeknownst to the waiter, the restaurant's owner had been watching the scene unfold from the kitchen. His wife had come in unannounced that day to experience the service anonymously, a habit they'd developed to ensure customers were treated with respect. But what she received instead was humiliation. The owner stepped forward, his expression stern, his steps deliberate. The waiter, oblivious to the storm about to hit, continued his tirade. Then, just as the room went silent, the owner approached the table. The restaurant owner approached the table with calm, measured steps, his eyes locked on the waiter. The other staff members immediately noticed his presence and froze mid-task. The waiter, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, let out a dismissive laugh and muttered under his breath, "Another complainer, I bet." The woman glanced at the owner, her expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. She had chosen to remain patient, despite the stares from other diners and the degrading attitude she'd endured. The owner, however, looked anything but calm. His jaw tightened as he reached the table, though he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he addressed the waiter in a firm, steady tone. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking directly at the young man. The waiter, clearly taken aback by the sudden presence of the boss, fumbled for words. "No, sir, nothing at all. Just a difficult customer," he said, shooting a glance at the woman. The owner's eyes narrowed. "Difficult," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Because she asked for something on the menu." He turned to the woman, softening his tone. "Ma'am, I apologize for any disrespect you've experienced. Is there something specific I can assist you with?" The woman smiled politely, though her voice was steady and confident. "I just wanted to know if the chef could prepare the special dish I've enjoyed here before. I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable." The owner nodded. "Of course. That's not a problem at all." He turned back to the waiter, his expression hardening again. "Care to explain why this simple request was such an issue for you?" The waiter shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance replaced by visible nervousness. I didn't know she was a regular," he stammered. "I thought she might be wasting our time." The room seemed to grow quieter, the tension thick in the air. The owner tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the waiter's face. "Wasting our time," he echoed. "That's an interesting way to describe a paying customer. Or do you reserve that treatment for certain people?" The waiter swallowed hard, realizing the implication of the question. He tried to backtrack, his words spilling out in a rush. "No, sir, I didn't mean it like that. I just assumed." "You assumed wrong." The owner cut him off sharply, his voice firm. "And in this business, assumptions like that cost us everything." The woman watched the exchange quietly, her calm demeanor unshaken. It was clear she wasn't the type to demand special treatment, but she also wasn't going to let this slide. She had worked hard alongside her husband to build the restaurant's reputation, And moments like this tested everything they stood for. The senior staff members in the kitchen exchanged glances, their silence heavy. One of them, an older chef who had been with the restaurant since it opened, finally spoke. "You know what," he said, his voice low but firm. "This place wasn't built on arrogance. It's built on respect, for the food, for the customers, and for each other. You forgot that tonight." The waiter flinched but didn't respond. What could he say? He knew they were right. The chef shook his head and went back to his station, leaving the waiter alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, the owner decided to take a walk around the restaurant, checking in with customers and ensuring their meals were satisfactory. He wanted to restore a sense of normalcy, but his mind was still preoccupied with what had happened. The incident wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of something deeper. Had he become too removed from the day-to-day operations? Had the team lost sight of the values that had once been their guiding principles? He approached a table near the kitchen where a family was finishing their meal. The father smiled and gave him a nod of approval. "The food is always great here," he said. "But I have to say, what you did earlier, that's real leadership. Not everyone would handle it the way you did." The owner forced a small smile. "Thank you," he said, though the words felt heavy. He didn't feel like a leader right now. He felt like someone trying to fix a crack in the foundation of something he had built with his own hands. As the evening wore on, the woman observed everything quietly from her seat. She noticed the way her husband interacted with the customers, his effort to make things right, even as the weight of the day showed in his posture. She also noticed the subtle changes in the staff's behavior, more attentive, more careful. The incident had left its mark on everyone, and now they were walking on eggshells, unsure of what might happen next. The tension in the air grew thicker when the waiter finally emerged from the kitchen. His face was pale, and his usual cocky demeanor was replaced by uncertainty. He glanced around the room, avoiding eye contact with the diners. It was clear he was struggling to muster the courage to face the consequences of his actions. He walked hesitantly toward the owner, who was now standing near the bar, speaking with one of the bartenders. The owner noticed him immediately and straightened, his expression unreadable. The waiter paused a few steps away, wringing his hands nervously. "Sir," he began, his voice shaky. "Can I speak with you?" The owner nodded, gesturing for him to step aside. They moved to a quieter corner of the restaurant, away from prying eyes and ears. The waiter hesitated, struggling to find the right words. He had never been good at admitting he was wrong, but tonight he didn't have a choice. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did was wrong. I didn't mean to cause trouble, and I didn't mean to make anyone feel disrespected." The owner crossed his arms, studying the young man carefully. "What exactly are you sorry for?" he asked, his tone firm but not harsh. The waiter swallowed hard. "For treating her the way I did," he said, nodding toward the woman. "I judged her without knowing anything about her, and that's not how we're supposed to treat people. I know I let you down, and I let the team down too." The owner didn't respond immediately, letting the silence hang between them. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to expect. Finally, the owner sighed and shook his head. "This isn't about letting me down," he said. "It's about the values we stand for. If you don't believe in those values, you have no place here. Do you understand that?" The waiter nodded quickly. "I do. I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes." The owner studied him for a moment longer, then glanced toward the woman. "You owe her an apology first," he said. The waiter's stomach sank, but he nodded again. He knew this was part of the process, no matter how difficult it might be. He turned and walked slowly toward her table, his steps heavy with apprehension. As he approached, the room seemed to quiet again, the other diners sensing the weight of the moment. The woman looked up as he reached her table, her expression calm but unreadable. He hesitated for a second, then took a deep breath. "Ma'am," He began, his voice unsteady. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I treated you earlier. It was wrong, and you didn't deserve that. I let my own assumptions get in the way. And I know that's not an excuse. I hope you can forgive me." The woman regarded him silently for a moment, her eyes steady and thoughtful. The room seemed to hold its breath, everyone waiting to see how she would respond. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Apologies are a good start," she said, "but actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about making this right, you'll need to show it, not just to me, but to everyone who comes through those doors." The waiter nodded, her words hitting him harder than he expected. "I will," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for giving me the chance." She didn't respond immediately, but after a moment, she gave him a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. As the waiter walked away, the tension in the room seemed to shift. The diners returned to their conversations, and the staff resumed their work, though the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The owner watched the scene unfold, his mind racing with thoughts about the future. He knew this was far from over, but the steps taken tonight were a start, a small but significant move toward restoring the values that had once defined the restaurant. And as he looked at his wife, he could see in her eyes the same determination he felt. They weren't done yet. The air in the restaurant seemed lighter as the waiter walked back to the kitchen, though tension still lingered beneath the surface. The woman's words had been firm but fair, and the owner hoped they would leave a lasting impact on his staff. However, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to address than one employee's mistake. Tonight had exposed a deeper issue, a crack in the foundation he had worked so hard to build. As he returned to his wife's table, he noticed her watching the room with the same sharp gaze she always had when assessing a situation. She gestured for him to sit down, her expression calm but serious. "We handled that well enough for now," she said softly, leaning closer so only he could hear. "But I don't think this is the end of it." The owner sighed and nodded, his eyes scanning the restaurant. "I know," he admitted. "There's a bigger problem here, one we can't ignore anymore." Before they could delve deeper into the conversation, the door to the restaurant swung open, and a tall man in a crisp suit walked in. He carried himself with an air of authority, his presence commanding attention immediately. The staff near the entrance froze, their faces a mix of recognition and unease. The owner straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening as he stood up to greet the man. "Paul," the newcomer said with a slick smile, extending a hand. "It's been a while." The owner hesitated before shaking his hand, his expression guarded. "Nathan," he replied curtly. "What brings you here tonight?" Nathan's smile widened, though there was something cold about it. "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood," he said casually, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Thought I'd stop by and see how things are going." The woman at the table watched the exchange carefully, her instincts immediately on high alert. She knew who Nathan was, a former business partner of her husband's, though that partnership had ended badly years ago. Nathan had been ambitious to a fault, cutting corners and prioritizing profits over principles. When they refused to compromise on their values, he had left, vowing to outshine them with his own ventures. Paul stepped aside, gesturing toward the bar. "We can talk over here," he said, his tone clipped. Nathan followed, still smiling as if he owned the place. The two men sat at the bar, and their conversation quickly grew tense. Nathan leaned in slightly, his voice low but forceful. "I hear you've been having some issues with your staff," he said, his words laced with mock sympathy. "It's tough, isn't it? Keeping everyone in line, maintaining that perfect image." Paul's expression hardened. "What's your point, Nathan?" he asked, his voice steady but sharp. Nathan chuckled, leaning back casually. "No need to get defensive," he said. "I'm just saying, if you ever need help, real help, I have resources, connections. You don't have to do this alone." Paul shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I know exactly what your kind of help looks like," he said, "and I'm not interested." Nathan's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Suit yourself," he said smoothly, "but don't say I didn't offer when things start falling apart." As Nathan's words hung in the air, the woman watched from across the room, her instincts screaming that his visit wasn't as casual as he claimed. She could see the way her husband's shoulders tensed, the barely concealed anger in his eyes. Nathan wasn't just here to stir up trouble. He was here to exploit their vulnerabilities. The tension escalated when one of the servers accidentally dropped a tray of glasses, the sound shattering the quiet hum of the restaurant. Nathan glanced toward the commotion, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Accidents happen," he said lightly, his words dripping with insinuation. "Sometimes they're a sign of bigger cracks." Paul clenched his fists under the bar, resisting the urge to respond. He knew Nathan was trying to provoke him, and he refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, he stood abruptly, signaling that the conversation was over. "Enjoy your evening," he said curtly before walking away. Nathan watched him go, his smile fading into a calculating expression. He turned toward the bartender, ordering a drink as if nothing had happened, but the glint in his eyes suggested otherwise. Back at the table, Paul sat down with a heavy sigh, his wife immediately leaning in. "What did he want?" she asked quietly. "Trouble," Paul muttered. "Same as always." She frowned, her sharp mind already piecing together the implications. "He doesn't show up for no reason," she said. "If he's here, he's planning something." Paul nodded, his gaze distant. "I know, and I can't help but feel like tonight was exactly the kind of opening he's been waiting for." Their conversation was interrupted by one of the senior staff members, who approached the table hesitantly. "Sir," she said quietly, glancing nervously at the bar, where Nathan was now chatting with another customer. "There's something you should see." Paul exchanged a look with his wife before standing and following the staff member toward the back office. The woman stayed behind, her instincts telling her to keep an eye on Nathan. As she watched him laugh and chat with the customers, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was up to something more dangerous than just stirring the pot. In the office, the senior staff member handed Paul a tablet, her face pale. "This came through our social media," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Paul took the tablet, his stomach sinking as he read the screen. Someone had posted a video of the earlier confrontation between the waiter and his wife. The caption was inflammatory, painting the restaurant in a negative light. Within minutes, the post had gained traction, with comments pouring in from people criticizing the establishment. Paul's heart pounded as he scrolled through the comments, some of them cruel, others calling for boycotts. This wasn't just a bad night. It was a PR disaster in the making. And the worst part was, he couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan had something to do with it. He returned to the dining area, his mind racing with how to handle the situation. As he passed by Nathan's table, he noticed the man smirking, his phone resting on the table. The pieces clicked together, and Paul's anger flared. But he knew he couldn't confront Nathan directly. Not yet. His wife caught his eye as he approached, immediately sensing the shift in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice low. Paul handed her the tablet, his jaw tight. She scanned the screen, her expression hardening. "This isn't just bad luck," she said. "He's trying to take us down." Paul nodded. "And if we're not careful, he'll succeed." The weight of the situation pressed down on them, the stakes higher than ever. They had worked too hard to let someone like Nathan destroy everything they had built. But as they looked around the restaurant, the cracks were already starting to show, and the battle was far from over. The tension in the restaurant was palpable as Paul stood in the middle of the dining area, his mind racing through potential solutions. He knew that Nathan's influence had already started to take root. People were whispering, eyes flicking nervously between him and his wife, the whispers barely audible, but carrying the weight of something more sinister. The situation was spiraling, and he could feel the walls closing in around them. His wife was already on the move, her mind sharp as ever. She knew they needed a plan. A real one, not just reactive measures. She'd always been the quiet strategist, the one who saw through the noise. "We can't let this continue," she said quietly, standing beside him now. "We need to take control of the narrative. And we need to do it fast." Paul nodded, but his mind was still reeling from the video. He had hoped they could handle things without the public knowing, but the damage had already been done. Their reputation, years in the making, was now under attack, and the worst part was, they weren't sure who else was involved. Was it just Nathan pulling the strings, or were there other forces at play? "I'll handle the staff," his wife continued. "You need to confront Nathan. Now." Paul hesitated, but he knew she was right. Nathan was the source of the chaos, and he had to be stopped before things got worse. He turned to look at the man sitting at the bar, casually swirling a drink in his glass, as if none of this was his doing. The smirk on Nathan's face was infuriating, but Paul steeled himself. There was no more room for hesitation. He walked toward Nathan, his every step deliberate. The restaurant had gone silent in anticipation, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the confrontation to unfold. Nathan noticed him approaching, his smile widening with that same smugness. Well, Nathan said, leaning back in his chair. "Came to check on the disaster I supposedly caused. Or are we finally ready to talk business?" Paul stood over him, his voice low but steady. "This ends tonight, Nathan." Nathan raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Oh, really? And what exactly are you planning to do about it?" "First, you stop playing games with us. You think you've won. That video won't destroy us," Paul said, his voice cutting through the tense silence of the room. "I'll make sure of it." Nathan's eyes flickered, but the smirk didn't fade. "You think this is about a video? This is about power, Paul. You've had your time at the top. Now, it's my turn." Paul clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "I didn't come here to listen to your nonsense. You've been trying to tear us down since the moment you walked in. But I won't let you use my business, my family, to get what you want." Nathan stood up slowly, his tall frame looming over Paul now. "You've always been the stubborn one, haven't you?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "That's why you'll never see the bigger picture. You're so caught up in playing the hero that you can't see when the game's already over." Paul felt his anger rise, but before he could respond, his wife stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're not going to get away with this, Nathan," she said, her tone fierce. "You've underestimated us, and that's your mistake." Nathan turned to face her, his grin faltering for a moment as if surprised by her confidence. "Oh, and what are you going to do? You've got nothing left to play with. No reputation, no backup. You're just a couple of washed-up dreamers." She met his gaze without flinching. "We've got something you'll never understand, a business built on integrity. And that's worth more than any cheap tricks you have up your sleeve." Nathan's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. The room was holding its collective breath, waiting for the next move. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the outcome was still uncertain, as if the battle could go either way. But then, in an unexpected twist, the silence was shattered. A loud crash came from the back of the restaurant, followed by a commotion that drew everyone's attention. Paul and his wife turned toward the noise, their instincts on high alert. Through the kitchen doors, one of the staff members rushed in, holding up his phone, his face pale with shock. "There's something you need to see," he said breathlessly, his voice trembling. The staff member handed the phone to Paul, who quickly glanced at the screen. His heart skipped a beat. The video that had been posted earlier wasn't the only one. A second video had surfaced. This time, it was Nathan, caught on camera just moments before entering the restaurant, speaking to an unidentified man. In the video, Nathan was heard discussing how to disrupt the restaurant's reputation, promising to take down Paul and his wife by any means necessary. The room was silent as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Nathan's face paled as the realization hit him. This was no longer just about the public video. This was about manipulation, deception, and an orchestrated attack. Paul turned slowly, his eyes cold with fury. "You really thought you could get away with this, didn't you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Nathan's bravado wavered, his expression shifting from smugness to something darker. "You don't know what you're messing with," he spat, his voice barely containing his rage. "This isn't over." But Paul's wife stepped forward again, her gaze unwavering. "It is now." In that moment, everything shifted. The atmosphere in the restaurant went from heavy tension to electric realization. The truth was out in the open. Nathan wasn't just a disgruntled former business partner. He was the mastermind behind the chaos, and now his lies had been exposed. Nathan's face twisted in fury as he realized there was no way out. He turned to make a break for it, but Paul grabbed him by the arm, stopping him in his tracks. The staff gathered around, watching as the scene unfolded, each of them realizing just how close they had come to losing everything. "You're done here," Paul said, his grip firm as he held Nathan in place. "I'm calling the authorities. You're not going anywhere." But just as he reached for his phone to call the police, a surprising voice interrupted. "Actually, Paul," said a calm, measured voice from behind him. The crowd parted as another figure emerged from the back. A woman stepped forward, one Paul hadn't seen in years. "You're not the one who needs to make the call." It was his former business partner, the woman who had walked away from the restaurant years ago. But this time, she wasn't offering a helping hand. She was here to finish what Nathan had started. The unexpected twist left everyone speechless. And just like that, the battle for the restaurant's future was far from over. The room fell into a stunned silence as the woman stepped forward. Her presence, calm yet authoritative, was enough to shift the entire atmosphere. Paul turned slowly, his mind reeling as he processed who had just appeared. It had been years since he last saw her, the former partner who had walked away from the business in the midst of their struggles. Her departure had left a scar, one that had haunted him for a long time. But now, here she was, standing before him, with a look that told him everything had changed. "You," Paul said, his voice thick with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" She smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "I could ask you the same thing, but I think you already know." His mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. She had left under difficult circumstances, refusing to compromise on the direction of the business. She had always been determined, but to return now, at this moment, was something Paul hadn't expected. "Is this your plan then?" he asked, his voice tight. "You've been working with Nathan all along." She met his gaze with an expression that was unreadable. "I didn't come here to make deals, Paul. I came to finish what you started." Paul's heart raced. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, he didn't know what to believe. Was she truly here to help them? Or was this just another play to take control of what they had built together? Behind him, his wife's face had hardened as she too processed the situation. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to leave," she said firmly, stepping closer to her husband. Her voice was unwavering, the determination clear in her tone. "Nathan's actions are one thing, but if you've been a part of this, I won't allow it." The woman's eyes flickered, but her composure remained. "I'm not here to destroy you. I've never wanted that. But you've made mistakes, Paul. You've let your pride get in the way of your business." Paul's jaw tightened. "You think you can do better?" After walking away when things got tough. For a moment, it seemed like the two of them might fall into old arguments, the unresolved tensions of their past rising once again. But then, unexpectedly, she softened. "I'm not here to pick up the pieces, Paul. I'm here because it's time for both of us to see the bigger picture." He didn't have the words to respond. What could he say to someone who had been a part of their success and their failure? What could he say to someone who had walked away, only to return now, in the midst of everything unraveling? Just then, Nathan, who had been standing quietly, watching the exchange, spoke up. "You've all missed the point. This isn't about your past. This is about the future." His voice was dripping with contempt, and he seemed to regain some of his usual arrogance now that the woman had arrived. "You think you've got this under control. You're all drowning, and you don't even see it." Paul turned toward Nathan, his eyes narrowing. "Enough," he said, his voice hard. "The games are over. You tried to tear us apart, and now you're exposed. You don't have any leverage left." Nathan's face twisted in frustration, his earlier bravado slipping away. "You still don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "This isn't just about you or your restaurant. This is about power. This is about taking control of what's mine." But before Nathan could continue, the woman cut him off. "Nathan, you've lost. You don't have the power you think you do." She turned back to Paul. "You've always been stubborn, Paul, but it's time to let go of the past. You can't keep fighting ghosts." Paul's heart raced as he took in her words. Could it really be true? Was it time to let go of the hurt and the bitterness that had been festering for so long? Could he accept that the business, the restaurant they had built together, was bigger than any of their individual conflicts? The tension in the room was thick, but slowly, Paul felt something shift within him. The years of frustration and resentment seemed to melt away, replaced by the realization that he had been fighting the wrong battle all along. Nathan was a distraction. The real fight was about preserving everything they had worked for, about protecting the restaurant, their staff, and their legacy. He turned to his wife, who was watching him intently, her expression a mixture of concern and hope. She had always been his rock, the one who kept him grounded when everything felt like it was falling apart. And now she was waiting for him to make the decision that would change everything. "I've been holding on to things I shouldn't have," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But I can't do this alone anymore." His wife's eyes softened, and she nodded. "We'll do this together," she said, her voice full of conviction. Turning back to the woman who had once been his partner, Paul met her gaze with newfound clarity. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice steady. The woman studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You need to move forward," she said simply. "The past is gone, but what you've built here is something worth saving. It's not too late to fix things, but it has to be a team effort. If you want to succeed, you need to trust the people around you, and you need to stop trying to do it all yourself." Paul nodded slowly, taking in her words. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but perhaps it didn't have to be a battle. Perhaps there was another way forward. And then, in a final twist of fate, a phone call came in, one that would change everything. It was from the authorities, confirming that Nathan had been under investigation for several months. His actions at the restaurant were only the tip of the iceberg. As the phone call ended, Paul and his wife exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. The truth was out, and the damage was already done. But they had won. They had survived. Nathan was gone. The woman had offered her help, and with her support, they would rebuild. The restaurant's future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, they could face it together. As the staff gathered around, ready to start fresh, Paul realized that the true strength of the business wasn't in the building, the menu, or the reputation. It was in the people who believed in it. And together, they would face whatever challenges came next, stronger than ever before. In the end, it wasn't just the restaurant that had been saved. It was the people who had put everything into it, the ones who had never given up. And that was what truly mattered.